The champagne glass shattered against the marble floor of the 23rd floor stairwell, and Tamsin Locke pressed the jagged stem into her palm, hard enough to draw blood she didn't register. The man in front of her, broad-shouldered, balaclava masked, with a suppressed Glock leveled at her sternum, seemed briefly confused by the fact that she hadn't screamed and run. She hadn't run because there was nowhere to go. She stood in the stairwell doorway in her wine-red silk dress, her heels long since kicked away somewhere on the Drake Hotel's 21st floor, and she had exactly one plan: do not let him through this door. Behind her, Theron Blackwell's voice came low and precise like a scalpel finding its angle. "Step aside, Miss Locke." She didn't move. "Tamsin," a warning now wrapped in something that wasn't quite anger. "You're bleeding," she said, not taking her eyes off the gunman, "and your right hand is my problem." His footsteps were almost silent behind her. Then his left hand closed around her wrist, steady, unyielding, the grip of a man who had rebuilt himself from wreckage and come out harder on the other side. He drew her back against his chest with a force that left no room for argument. "I'm not fragile," he said against her temple, his voice a low current that moved through her like a charge. "Did you think scars make a man less dangerous?" She had no answer for that. She would have won 8 weeks from now, looking back at this moment from the far side of everything that followed. But standing there in the dark stairwell with his heart beating steadily against her spine while a hired killer recalibrated his aim, Tamsin Locke understood, for the first time, and with the absolute clarity of genuine terror, that she had fundamentally misread Theron Blackwell from the very beginning. 8 weeks earlier. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, slipped under the door of Tamsin's studio apartment in Wicker Park. It was printed on cream-colored paper with a letterhead she recognized immediately: Blackwell Capital Partners, one of the 4 or 5 firms whose filing cabinets she'd spent 3 semesters organizing during temp work between nursing rotations. She read it twice, then she called her brother. Orson Locke had the decency to answer on the second ring, which was more than he deserved. "How much?" she asked. A long pause. 840,000. Tamsin sat down on the kitchen floor. She didn't remember deciding to. "Orson." "It wasn't gambling, Tamsin, it was an investment." "It's always an investment until it isn't." She pressed the heel of her hand against her eye socket. "And now what? What does this letter mean?" What the letter meant, as Orson explained it in a voice that kept cracking, was this: a man named Neil Croft, CFO of Blackwell Capital, the one who'd handled Orson's account, had drawn up an arrangement. Tamsin had medical training and was finishing her nursing degree. Theron Blackwell, the firm's founder and CEO, had recently undergone his 3rd reconstructive surgery following injuries sustained in a car bomb explosion 18 months prior. He required a dedicated in-home medical aid for a period of no less than 12 months to manage post-operative care, medication protocols, and physical therapy coordination. In exchange for this service, Orson's debt would be forgiven in full. The letter was not a request. Tamsin thought about her nursing boards 3 months away. She thought about her student loans. She thought about her brother's voice cracking like a teenage boy's. She packed a bag that night. The Blackwell penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of a building overlooking Millennium Park, and everything about it communicated wealth without announcement. The kind of money old enough to have stopped being loud. Severin, the head of security, met her at the private elevator. He was a large, quiet man with a veteran's posture and eyes that catalogued threats before they materialized. He carried her bag without commenting on its modest size. "Mr. Blackwell is in his office," Severin said. "He'll see you when he's ready." He was not ready for 40 minutes. Tamsin used the time to examine the living room with a nurse's systematic attention. She noted the absence of scatter rugs, the widened door frames, the custom desk visible through the partially open office door. Its surface height adjusted, she suspected, to accommodate a different reach. Someone had thought carefully about this space. Then Theron Blackwell appeared in the doorway. He was not what the letter had prepared her for. The explosion had taken the right side of his face from temple to jaw. The scar tissue was healed but irreducible, a landscape of pale, taut skin interrupting what had clearly once been a conventional kind of good-looking. His right hand, visible where his cuff was rolled to the elbow, showed the same damage tracking up the forearm. He was broad through the shoulders, dark-eyed, the kind of stillness that didn't come from calm but from control. He looked at her with the frank assessment of someone who didn't have patience for social performance. "Mrs. Locke," he said, his voice was even, "you're younger than Croft's file suggested." "You're more mobile than his letter implied," she replied. Something shifted in his expression, not quite amusement. "Sit down." She sat. He lowered himself into the chair across from her with a deliberateness she catalogued automatically, favoring the left, right shoulder slightly compensated, right elbow bent at a careful angle. The nerve damage was more extensive than the letter had indicated. "The arrangement is straightforward," he said. "You'll monitor my post-surgical recovery, manage my physical therapy schedule, handle medication logistics, and accompany me to any events where a medical presence is required. You'll have a private suite, a salary above your current market rate. At the end of 12 months, Orson Locke's account is zeroed. And if I want to leave before 12 months. The debt reinstates," he said it without cruelty, simply fact. "I didn't write those terms, Ms. Locke. Croft handles the contracts." "Do you always let your CFO handle your contracts?" A pause. "The no eyes," he said. "I don't." The first 3 weeks taught Tamsin the rhythm of a controlled life. Theron's days were structured to the quarter hour, conference calls from 6 to 8 in the morning. Physical therapy with his off-site therapist on Tuesdays and Thursdays, board materials reviewed every evening. He ate at his desk, slept 5 hours, and communicated in sentences so stripped of excess that conversations with him felt like receiving a telegraph. She caught him in the private gym at 5:30 one morning, the kind of accident that happens when insomnia and professional curiosity overlap. He had a resistance band looped around a fixed bar, pulling it slowly with his right hand in measured increments. 10 seconds of tension, 10 of release. The expression on his face was the most honest thing she'd ever seen in a person. Not pain exactly. More like negotiation, a man having a quiet, ongoing argument with his own body and refusing to lose it. He heard her footsteps. "You don't need to observe, Miss Locke." "Actually, I do." She crossed the room, picked up his chart from the folding table, and read it with the professional attention she'd give any patient. "Your grip strength on the right is down 6% from last week's baseline. You've been overusing it." He didn't answer. "I'm a nurse, Mr. Blackwell. I watch everything. That's what you're paying me for." He looked at her for a long moment, then, unexpectedly, "There's coffee in the kitchen." It wasn't an apology, but it was something. Neil Croft arrived on a Thursday in November, unannounced except for a text to Severin that Severin relayed with a careful neutrality that told Tamsin he didn't much like the man. Croft was polished in the way that telegraphed active effort, the cufflinks too considered, the tan too, even for Chicago in autumn. He smiled at Tamsin in the way men smile at furniture they've decided is decorative. He spread the merger agreement across the dining room table and walked Theron through it in broad strokes, his eyes tracking to Theron's right hand with a frequency he probably thought was subtle. Tamsin refilled the coffee carafe, took her position near the window with a tablet she appeared to be reading, and memorized the merger agreement page by page as it lay open across the table. Page 41, 42, 47. She'd spent 2 semesters doing data entry for a private equity firm. 3 years of nursing school was funded by knowing exactly where to look in documents other people assumed were unreadable at a glance. She found the clause. That evening, after Croft had gone, she knocked on the office door. "Page 47, she said, when Theron looked up. "Section 9, subsection C. It's tucked between the indemnification clauses and the governing law paragraph." If you miss 3 consecutive board meetings, for any reason, including medical ones, your proxy voting rights transfer to the CFO pending executive committee review. She paused. The next 3 meetings are all in the next 7 weeks. Theron went very still, the kind of stillness that precedes rather than follows movement. How did you read that document? I worked data entry at 6 firms between sophomore and junior year. I can read a merger agreement upside down in less time than it takes to pour coffee. She met his eyes. I don't forget numbers. He studied her across the office. This woman in borrowed professional clothes, with a nursing student's trained posture and a temp worker's practiced invisibility, who had apparently just surfaced a trap buried in 68 pages of dense legalese. "Sit down, Miss Locke," he said quietly. This time it wasn't a command. It was something closer to an invitation. The Blackwell Capital annual charity auction was held at the Drake Hotel on a Friday evening in December. Tamsin wore a wine-red silk dress that had appeared on her bed the morning of the event. No notes, no explanation, and a pair of heels that were uncomfortably perfect for her size. She stood beside Theron in the grand ballroom beneath chandeliers that fractured light into 1,000 small suns. The room was heavy with money and calculation and expensive perfume, and she could feel the precise moment Theron registered every significant person who entered his periphery. He didn't scan. He absorbed, steadily and without movement, the way a wide-angle lens collects a whole room at once. Croft hovered 30 feet away, playing the host's deputy with a martini in his hand. Then Gerard Fleming appeared. Fleming ran Meridian Defense, Blackwell's primary competitor for 3 federal contracts currently under review. He was silver-haired and wide-shouldered, and had the practiced bonhomie of a man who weaponized affability. He extended his hand to Theron's left side, grip first, the choice of a man who had made a calculation. "Blackwell," he said with the warmth of someone delivering a verdict. "Good to see you out. We were starting to wonder if the recovery had." A pause, calibrated to land, slowed things down over there. Theron looked at him without expression. "The contracts under review are performing at 14% above projection, Gerard. Slowing down doesn't quite cover it." Fleming's smile held. His gaze dropped briefly to Theron's right hand where it rested against his leg. "Hard to stay sharp when you're managing so many complications. I imagine the board has concerns." "The board's concerns," Theron said evenly, "are not your business." Fleming turned his attention to Tamsin, the kind of look that reduced a person to their function. "And this is your medical aid?" Tamsin smiled with her mouth only. "Tamsin Locke. And you're Gerard Fleming, whose Q3 federal deliverables were flagged in the Inspector General's report for a 6-week delay, the one his communications team called a scheduling adjustment, which is an interesting way to describe missing a statutory deadline by 43 days. She tilted her head. "I read a lot while I wait. Mr. Blackwell takes his medication very punctually." A beat of silence so complete she could hear the ice in Fleming's glass settle. She kept going, voice pleasant, cadence unhurried. "I also noticed that Meridian's last 2 government contract renewals included a bid consultant who shares a mailing address with one of your shell holding companies." "That's probably coincidence." "The Inspector General tends to find coincidences interesting, though." Fleming muttered something about excusing himself, and did not do it gracefully. 30 feet away, Croft set down his martini. "You are remarkably well-informed for a nurse," Theron said very quietly beside her. "Former temp data entry clerk," she said. "Current remarkably well-informed nurse." He looked down at her, and for one unguarded second something moved in his face that had nothing calculated about it. Then the chandeliers went out. The first shot took out the chandelier in the far corner of the ballroom, raining crystal across the east end of the room. The second went through the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking Michigan Avenue. Screaming erupted like a wave, and the crowd became a current. "Severin." Theron's voice cut through the noise without rising. He'd already moved, his left arm hooked around Tamsin's waist, pulling her low and fast toward the north wall. Severin materialized from somewhere in the chaos. 3 shooters. Exits covered. Service corridor is clear. Croft is gone. Theron's expression did not change, but his jaw set like poured concrete. Get us to the stairwell. They moved through the hotel kitchen at a crouch. Tamsin kicking off her heels at the pass-through. Severin clearing the way ahead, Theron's hand never leaving her arm. The kitchen staff had already scattered. Steam rose from an abandoned pot on a burner no one had thought to turn off. The fluorescence hummed obliviously above it all. Then Severin held up a fist and they stopped. 2 men in the corridor outside the stairwell door. Severin communicated something wordless to Theron with a look. Side passage, Theron said. The side passage brought them to the 23rd floor via a secondary stairwell door that Tamsin suspected was not on any guest map. She filed this away. The fact that Theron knew this building's service infrastructure from memory, the fact that he had chosen tonight's venue himself. In the stairwell, Severin pressed forward to scout the lower landings, which left Tamsin and Theron and the sound of careful footsteps ascending from the floors below. 1 set, then 2. She looked around the landing. There was a bar cart left at the top of the stairs, event overflow, abandoned in the evacuation chaos. She grabbed a champagne flute by the stem and moved to the doorway. The first masked man came through, and she was already there. She didn't try to fight him. She blocked the doorway, the broken glass catching the emergency lighting, and she simply did not move. This was the moment she'd been standing in since before she knew what it was. Behind her, Theron said her name, low, precise. She felt the warmth of him a half-second before she registered he'd moved. Step aside, Miss Locke. You're bleeding. The cut on his forearm was from a champagne shard in the ballroom, minor, but the nerve-damaged skin around it wouldn't register pain reliably. And your right hand is my problem. His left hand closed around her wrist, and he drew her back against his chest with a calm more unnerving than any urgency. His voice at her temple was quiet, and even the way it was every morning at 5:30 when he was bargaining with his own body in the gym. I'm not fragile, Tamsin. She felt the breath behind the words. Did you think scars make a man less dangerous? He moved around her in a single fluid motion and put 2 shots center mass on the first man, 1 on the second, before either had cleared the doorframe. The suppressed reports echoed once and went quiet. Both men went down. Tamsin stood very still. Theron turned back, holstering the weapon beneath his jacket with his left hand. His fully dominant hand, she understood now, the one he had rebuilt completely in the 18 months since the bomb. He looked at her with the same expression he wore in the gym, precise, stripped of performance and completely certain. The right hand, he said, matter-of-factly, is for appearances so they keep watching the wrong side. Severin drove them out through the loading dock in a car that had been idling since 7 p.m., positioned there before the gala began, she realized. Theron sat in the back with the particular stillness of a man whose mind was running several parallel operations. Chicago scrolled past the tinted windows in blues and grays. Tamsin pressed a folded square of her wrap against the cut on his forearm without asking. He let her. Croft set this up, she said. Croft set this up 6 months ago. He looked at the window. He needed me dead or incapacitated before the end of the fiscal year. Meridian was the buyer. Fleming's company acquires Blackwell's government contracts in an emergency dissolution. They split the work. Croft gets a board seat at Meridian and immunity from the commission irregularities you apparently already know about. How long have you known? I found the first piece of the clause you identified in September. I've been 3 moves ahead since October. He looked at her finally. I didn't know about you until your brother called Croft. I didn't know what Croft would send me. She absorbed that. You let him send me anyway. I wanted to understand his thinking. The ghost of something crossed his face, and then I wanted to understand yours. She sat with that for a full block. You could have told me, she said. You were safer not knowing the full picture. A pause. That was a judgment call I made without your input. It was probably not my best one." It definitely wasn't. He almost smiled, not quite, but close enough that she catalogued it. The secondary office was in River North, the kind of building that looked disused from the street and was the opposite underneath. Theron worked through the night at a steel table circled by monitors, and Tamsin stayed first in the adjacent room, and then, when it became clear the adjacent room was too far from whatever was unfolding, pulled a chair to the doorway and stayed there. She watched him work. She'd spent 8 weeks watching him move through a world that had decided he was diminished. The business press with their recovery angle, the competitors who looked at his right hand and made their calculations, Croft with his careful page 47, and she had apparently missed entirely the actual man. He worked with his left hand on the keyboard and his voice on 3 calls simultaneously, and by 4 in the morning, Blackwell Capital's legal team had presented federal investigators with a 400-page document package that Theron had apparently been assembling since October. Croft's real estate holdings, the shell company structure, the Meridian back channel, communications with Fleming going back 11 months. By 5 a.m., Croft had been picked up at O'Hare with a carry-on and a one-way ticket. "You built the whole trap," Tamsin said when Severin had relayed the news and the room went quiet. "I built a system," Theron said. Croft walked into it himself. "Because he thought you were distracted, recovering. Because he watched the wrong hand." She stood from her chair and walked to the table. He looked up at her. Really looked, the way he had in the gym that first morning, direct and measuring and entirely without the social buffer most people kept permanently engaged. "My 12 months end in January," she said. "Yes." She studied him. When was Orson's debt cleared? The pause was long enough to be its own answer, then August. August, 4 months ago, before the gala, before the stairwell, before page 47, before any of it. She thought about how to be angry. The anger was there, findable if she reached for it, but reaching for it would require ignoring the gym at 5:30 and the almost smile and his voice at her temples saying, "I'm not fragile," with the quiet urgency of a man who had needed, for a very long time, exactly one person to believe him. "You kept me here under false pretenses," she said, "which makes you worse than advertised." "Yes. And you were going to let January come and tell me then." "I was going to tell you," he said, "when I was certain you wouldn't leave before I had the chance to make a case." "A case for what?" He stood from the table. With his left hand and the careful secondary brace of his right, he was at eye level with her in the same motion. She had the impression of a man spending real effort and refusing to let it show on his face. The same negotiation she'd watched at 5:30 in the morning, and it moved through her like a current she hadn't braced for. "Stay," he said. It came out stripped down and completely without performance, the way he spoke every morning in the gym, the way he'd said step aside in the stairwell, except now it was the opposite request entirely. Not for Orson, not for the contract. "Stay because I need someone who reads the right page and stands in the doorway and brings me things I haven't thought to look for." He stopped, recalibrated. "Stay because since October, I have not had a single morning meeting I didn't manufacture a reason to extend." The room was very quiet. Severin was very diplomatically absent. "I want hazard pay," Tamsin said. He exhaled, and this time it was the real thing. Not almost a smile, but an actual one, brief and genuine, and a little startled by itself. "Name your terms, Miss Locke." She leaned into his hand, tilted her face up toward his, and decided she was done keeping a careful professional distance from the only man who'd ever looked at her like she was the one thing in the room worth paying attention to. "Tamsin," she said, "we survived a shooting. You can probably call me Tamsin." He kissed her with the same precision he brought to everything, deliberate, exact, and completely certain of its direction. She held his jacket lapel in both hands and kissed him back, and for a long moment the room existed only as the space directly between them. When they separated, he was still watching her with the expression she was finally learning to read. A man who had spent 18 months being measured by the wrong instrument, seen clearly for the first time by the only set of eyes paying attention to what actually mattered. "The board meets Monday," he said. "I'll be there." "You don't have to." "Mr. Blackwell." She looked up at him steadily. "I read page 47. I know exactly which meetings matter. I'll be there." He touched her face once briefly. Then he reached for his phone and went back to work. Outside, Chicago was beginning to gray toward morning. Somewhere across the river, Gerard Fleming was fielding very unpleasant phone calls from people whose names he'd never expected to see on his screen. Neil Croft was in a federal holding room with a lawyer who was about to have an equally terrible day, and Theron Blackwell, scarred and rebuilt, and considerably more intact than anyone watching The Wrong Hand had bothered to calculate, was already 3 moves into the next thing. Tamsin poured 2 cups of coffee, set one beside the keyboard without a word, and pulled her chair to the table. The world had assumed the fire had broken him, but fire doesn't break the things it hardens. It only burns away everything that was never load-bearing to begin with, and what had always been underneath Theron Blackwell was something no boardroom coup, no hired shooter, no page 47 could reach. The only person who had ever found it was the woman who had known, from the very first morning which hand to watch.